And in a nod to the title of this discussion, were you in any way addressing the patriarchy issue, and would you object to your books being labeled as feminist texts? So perhaps, Christina, you could go first.
Sure. So, I mean, to kind of, I suppose, go back to the start, I first had the idea in early 2018. I think, like a lot of people, I was very aware of the cultural conversation that was happening around women and kind of structural sexism, and how, in many ways, how little had changed, I suppose, for a very long time in terms of the way that men and women interact, certainly in professional settings. And I also read The Power by Naomi Alderman, which was one of the first books that I'd read that really explored, I suppose, in quite a modern way, how if you kind of completely shift some kind of gender dynamic, you can look at that in a speculative fiction lens and really see what an alternative world would look like. So I remember being in the library and kind of looking at books and trying to pick something out, and then thinking, okay, so the power is what happens if men are physically kind of no longer the most powerful. But what happens if you just didn't have men anymore? Like, what if you've had this very sudden restructuring of society? What would that look like? What would the world look like without men? So that's really where the idea came from. And then I started writing in late 2018 and sold the book in early 2020. I don't think I ever thought about the facts. I mean, I think that whenever you're writing a novel, it's such a personal endeavor. I mean, it's basically you and a laptop and an idea forming these characters for 100,000 words. So I wasn't thinking about any kind of other writers, really. And to be honest, the main people, if you'd asked me in 2018 who I was inspired by in terms of speculative fiction authors, to be honest, the two key names that would have come up were Margaret Atwood and Naomi Alderman, who were both women. But I think that inevitably, with a book with the title The End of Men, obviously there is a presumption that it is to some extent a feminist text, and it is. But I also kind of say that it's in many ways feminist, almost kind of in consequence as opposed to by design. The point of the book is not to kind of in any way say that I don't like men. It's more to kind of explore, I suppose, structurally what the world would look like if you had to rebuild it very quickly, and so you weren't kind of constrained, I suppose, by the historical structure inequality that we currently have.
Would you like to take it from there, Amy, and tell us your perspective and how your book first started in your head?
Sure. So my dad actually lives in Manningtree. He moved there around the time I started university from London. So it's a place I know very well, and down there at Christmases, like a few times a year. And it's quite a sleepy sort of commuter town, maybe about an hour and a half outside of London. Very beautiful and bucolic and all of that, but also has kind of a strangely cursed energy to it, as many beautiful places in England do. And the Witchfinder General, who was a real person who lived in Essex in the south of England in the 1640s, and was thought to have been responsible for the persecution and subsequent execution of around 300 women and men over the course of a few years. Kind of began his career in Manningtree, and it's pretty much kind of the only thing really of national historical significance that has ever happened there. It's still just as sleepy today as it probably was then. And so I kind of fell down various kind of online research rabbit holes, and these various contemporary accounts of the trials, and Hopkins's early career, the Witchfinder General's early career. And they are these fascinating documents for all sorts of reasons. They offer this snapshot of a specific community in a specific place and time, and the kind of the lusts and rivalries that intersect there. And so they're very compelling just for that reason, I think, to an author. But something I have always been quite interested in is kind of, I guess, the silences of history and the lacunae and the stories that are kind of elided from national myth, particularly somewhere like England. And I thought one of the things that was most rich about these contemporary documents from the 1640s was the insight they offered into the texture of working class women's lives specifically, which is something you hardly ever get anywhere else. I mean, you tend to get the most comprehensive documents of what working class women's lives were like when something horrible has happened to them, basically. And I was going through kind of a bit of a fallow period in terms of writing poetry. I hadn't written a poem in about a year, and I wanted to be writing something. So these documents, these accounts at the time, kind of formed a skeleton I could add meat to in terms of building a narrative. And when it comes to kind of the feminist text label, I am a feminist. But I'm somewhat chary of kind of the feminist text idea, particularly because I think it can be used quite cheaply as almost like a marketing device these days. And I think that kind of can have somewhat of a flattening and simplifying and siloing effect, like, oh, you know, this is a girl's book about girls. So yeah, I wouldn't object to it, but it wouldn't be kind of the first label I would apply to the text myself, I suppose. Yeah.
No, fair enough. And the moment some labels are applied to things, it does include some people and, well, exclude some people, not exclude some people, but send away some people, perhaps, who will think of it in a certain kind of way.
I suppose kind of perhaps what I mean is I think one of the reasons why witch trial narratives, and there are a lot now, well, there's been kind of a slew of them in the past few years, is in some ways actually because they simplify what are quite complicated ideas. They offer kind of easy answers to quite complicated questions, because they're these stories where, like, the bad guy literally has a black beard and wears a big black hat. He's obviously the bad guy, and I think kind of a lot of questions that are sort of at the forefront of kind of fourth wave feminism, if you want to call it that, are a lot more complicated than that. Something we've been dealing with in kind of, well, we deal with every day, but particularly in terms of Me Too, in terms of recent high profile instances of violence against women all around the world, is that the bad guys aren't obviously evil. And that's, I suppose that's something that is quite difficult to reckon with, and I think sometimes a kind of a shallow approach to the past from a sort of feminist perspective, yeah, as I say, can flatten that idea. Yeah.
I hear you. I hear you. Christina, your book has come out at the time of a very, very real pandemic, right? And in a world where also, aside from all the tragedy that we've seen and all the way life has just gone into this peculiar hiatus for so many of us for so long, it's a world in which everyone has become an expert on virology and vaccines and immunology, and everybody knows everything now. When you started writing, these things were not exactly, mainstream public discourse. So I'd like to know how you went about teaching yourself the science of what you write.
Really good question. Yeah, I mean, I'm very hopeful that my next dystopian novel, and indeed any other novel I write, does not come true. I'm answering to Cassandra, and I'm not necessarily sure that I like that element of the kind of publicity process. It's very weird to have spent, a year and 3 months really writing properly a book that has a pandemic so kind of woven through it, and then to be going through it in real life has been very odd. And the ironic thing for me is also that I really set out to answer this speculative question: what does the world look like without men? And in many ways, a pandemic was just a means to an end. It was the best narrative device I could think of to have, in a feasible, real way, kind of 90% of the male population disappear. But I'm not a scientist at all by training. I studied law and I work as a lawyer alongside writing. So for me, a lot of it was just kind of going onto the BMJ website and the Lancet. I have a few friends who happily were medical students at the time, who may have let me borrow their logins. And it was just trying to make sure that the science was feasible. And I'm always conscious of this. I think that, I don't view the book as science fiction. I view the book as speculative fiction. I'm not trying to explore kind of a scientific issue. For example, I'm not trying to explore how something would work in space. It's more an alternative reality that is quite closely mapped onto our own. I think of them as kind of two layers. So I just wanted to make sure that how the pandemic was created was feasible. And I actually originally, in the draft that went out on submission to editors and was bought, had the pandemic being started by Pangolin, which then when the book was kind of about to go out in advance copy proofs, my editor was like, we have to change this because people are going to think that you stole this from real life when you didn't, because at the time everyone was talking about pangolins. That was very weird. But kind of, I've been quite pleased actually with generally the response. And one of my friends who is now a doctor read it. She was like, this, makes sense. Obviously, there is no easy way scientifically, or maybe you'll be glad to know, happily, there is no easy, scientific, feasible way in which a virus could so extremely impact men. The virus kills 90% of the male population and not affect women at all. So I kind of I just had to make sure that the average person who doesn't have a degree in like genetics or has a kind of advanced medical degree would think it was feasible. So I just researched it. But then the pandemic element, I suppose that is very different. I could never have foreseen that these phrases, and I think I don't actually use the phrase social distancing in the book, but when you research pandemic literature, pandemics have existed forever. Obviously, COVID is a once in a really multiple generations event. But, there have been other pandemics even over the last 20 years that were much more controlled and didn't impact us in quite the same way, at least in the UK. I think this is something where if you look at the literature, certainly across Asia, there have been far more pandemics kind of over the last 20 years. So there's a lot of public health literature about how people respond to pandemics, kind of key advice that's given. So those phrases and those concepts and behaviors are things that we're all now aware of, but that were very easily available to me, if I just researched it a little bit. But I hope that when people read the book, and generally people tell me actually that they find the book quite comforting. And I think that's because the pandemic in the book is so different, and it's in many ways so much worse, which is not to undermine the gravity of COVID. But, 90% of the people who get the virus in the book die, which is obviously kind of about as extreme as a pandemic could get. That I think having a book where there is a beginning, a middle, and an end, so you get to kind of have this sense of closure at the end of the story, is something that we don't have in real life. We're still living through a pandemic and have been now for going on 2 years. So even though I'm sure it is in some ways, especially at the beginning of the book, quite weird to see people worrying about a virus that doesn't really have a name and they don't know how to deal with it, ultimately I hope that the resolution you get in the book, which spans 6 years, ultimately makes for a reading experience that really separates the book from what we're going through right now.
And very quickly, has the science that you had in the book, do you think it stood up to what has happened in real life, given that they're very different infections? Has anyone questioned the science? Do you feel that you've done a good job of doing the science?
I'm happy with it. I mean, it's also that thing of like, I haven't managed to fit in the last few years, like a master's degree in virology. So I'm sure maybe that there are people who have far more knowledge about it than I do that maybe don't think it stands out. But no, I think that the vast majority, the average reader, I think reads the book and the science that's in the book adds to it. I thought it would be a bit of a cop out. I remember my agent and I talking about this, and we just felt it would be a cop out to have, there are two characters in the book who are trying to find a vaccine. There's a character in the book who is a doctor who treats patient zero and helps to track down where the virus came from. It just would have been a cop out to not actually include some explanation of the science and then why a vaccine is difficult and why it comes about. Although I will say that I'm very happy about how quickly we have a COVID vaccine. I remember in the book, when you research vaccines historically, the absolute quickest that a vaccine could really be done was about 2 years. And really, even with a lot of research and funding, it was more like 5 to 7. And I won't spoil the exact timing of the book, but I went for a kind of relatively short time frame because without a vaccine in the book, really, the population of the world can't really start to recover. So, for the narrative, I needed it to be quite quick. And I thought, I hope that doesn't seem odd and just lacking in feasibility. And then, of course, in real life, we had a vaccine miraculously quickly. So that's one of the nice things where real life kind of overtook my speculation.
Yeah, but yes, if I saw something that connected you to your books aside from what was happening to women, is that I think you're predicting this could be the subject of Amy's next book, and you would be the witch. But Amy, I have a question for you about your book is written around real life events, things that most of us know happened, not in detail unless we are students of history of that time. What were you reading to understand this era, and why did you feel the need to do this retelling, part fiction and part fact, of that time?
As I said earlier, there's kind of almost a a glut of witch hunt fiction that's around the sort of past 5 years or so. But it kind of came back to that Toni Morrison thing of, if you can't find the book you want to read about something, you have to write it. And one of the things there are some witch trial novels I really like. Rivka Galkin's Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, and there are quite a lot I don't really like. And one of the things that struck me about quite a lot of them is, as I was kind of saying in answer to your last question, there were these amazing true stories of these women, but very often a lot of the accounts of English historical witch trials, they tend to elide the actual, often working class, often elderly, often disabled women who actually were the majority of the people who experienced this, in favor of inventing a character who is nobility or very solidly middle class who didn't actually exist. And I found that interesting. So I felt that kind of this story hadn't been told, as I say, in kind of in the way that I wanted to read it. It sounds I don't know, but that was part of my motivation. And to kind of get into the time period, I wasn't going in kind of completely raw. I studied English literature at university, and the early modern period was sort of my specialty. So I was familiar with Milton and sort of the literature of the time, which obviously is kind of a massive part of why there was a kind of witch craze in England at this time, was the printing press and the way rumour and kind of suspicion was able to spread around the country and indeed across Europe in a way that they never had before. So I did quite a lot of, the obvious research reading, the kind of classic texts of that, Religion, Decline of Magic by Keith Thomas, and kind of those sorts of works. But I also immersed myself kind of as firmly as I could in the contemporary literature of the time, because I felt that was a really important way of getting into the language and kind of the declension of these characters and the expressions and things they would use, which I wanted to try and be as accurate with as possible. So yeah, I was kind of trying to live and breathe their world as authentically as possible. And I think one of the most interesting things about that project was what I kind of came away feeling like a key difference, if not the key difference, between our world, England now and England in the 1640s, was the way belief in this very Manichaean belief in God and the devil as active forces that govern people's lives. The devil was real to them. He could turn up at your front door and ask you for something, and you would need to know how to react. Is something that is completely, I think, alien to most people living today. And rather than kind of approach that from quite a smug modern perspective of you sort of silly historical people with their superstitious beliefs, I wanted to try and kind of engage with it honestly, and actually try and think myself into what it must have felt like to govern your desires and your aspirations and your entire life around this really pervasive belief in God and damnation. So I think that was kind of the key to getting into the story for me. I hope that answers your question. Long answer.
It does. Thank you for that answer. We are coming close to the time where we will take questions from the audience, and they have been coming in, and our tech team has been collecting them. But I will ask you one tiny question, Amy. The decision to use language that was somewhere, there were words that I had to look up, all right? Quite a few here and there, but mostly I didn't. But I mean, the decision for that narrative voice, that not quite period, because that would of course obviously I think be indecipherable to most of us, but not contemporary either.
It's interesting. So I think it almost comes from, I've often been asked, like, what's the transition from writing poetry to writing prose? Kind of, why did you do that, and what advantages do you think you have as kind of a writer of prose coming from poetry. And I think one of the kind of perhaps quirks of my prose that comes from me perhaps being a poet first and foremost is that I think when you're a poet, clarity is in some ways not the enemy, but you have less of an obsession with the idea of clarity. And one of the things that I think is the difference between people who enjoy poetry and people who don't is that to enjoy poetry properly, I think sometimes you need to accept that not everything is laid out for you, that it can be difficult, and that not understanding is sometimes part of the pleasure of it. And so I think a combination of wanting to evoke the sense of confusion and chaos of Civil War England felt quite important, and language felt like one of the ways of doing that. And also kind of a love of sound and complication that's sort of inherent in the text of this period, like I say, like Paradise Lost, was something I really wanted to convey. So yeah, I think I was very much of the attitude of there is a pleasure in kind of joining the characters in their confusion and their disorientation sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. When I read the book all at one go, and I tend to get immersed in what I read, and I pick up vocabulary. So if I've been reading Arthur Conan Doyle, I speak that way for a little while, and I mystified a few friends. But I'm going to put in a few questions that we've got from our audience now. I do have one more thing that I want to ask you, but because it's very important to have our audience being part of this as well. Christina, a question for you. This is from Nitin L. Does the end of men necessarily lead to an end to patriarchy?
Great question. The way that I've written it, arguably, yes. And I mean, this is one of the things with speculative fiction, is that there's so many different ways you can interpret, one question. There's a lot of different answers you can come to. I think the way that I viewed it was that I tried to view it as realistically as possible. I like to write what I think of as hyper-realistic speculative fiction. And I thought that if there was a virus that we quite quickly knew didn't affect women, so women were safe, although they could transmit it, and it killed 90% of the world's men, but there would be a time when even those 10% of men who are safe don't know that they're safe. I just couldn't fathom how kind of really any men would be able to function normally, at least in that kind of key, kind of white hot moment of panic where really the world is shifting. And I think that if you have women having to run literally everything, keep the countries and world lights on and just keep the society functioning to the extent it can, even for 6 months to a year, that kind of transition is very hard to then get, back out of. It's very difficult to then upend that power structure when there's only 10% of men left. And I touch on how things would happen differently in different countries within the book. Unfortunately, I can't deal with kind of as much variety as I'd like to. There's already a lot of perspectives in the book, and it's 400 pages if you didn't want it to kind of keep expanding. But I think it's entirely possible that in maybe some countries, depending on if a country kind of shut down quick enough, that could be almost the reverse. It could be if you manage to avoid the virus kind of getting into the country, there could be a kind of hardening almost of the patriarchy. But the way that I wrote it, yes, the end of men does lead to an end of the patriarchy. Whether it, as one of the characters in the book, who is a kind of men's rights activist, he claims that the gynarchy has started. Whether that is actually necessarily true or just his conspiracy theory, I think kind of depends on your interpretation.
Thank you for that. Amy, a question for you. This one is from Vismaya Sharma. Do aspects of this 17th century story remain eerily true even today?
Yes, I would say absolutely so. Partly because witch hunts are an ongoing phenomenon in certain parts of the world. I can't remember the exact statistic off the top of my head, but it's still in the double figures of countries globally where witchcraft is still a capital crime. And obviously, the context for that is very different from what it was in 17th century England, but they are not a purely historical phenomena. And kind of I wanted to be really clear about that in my afterword. But aside from kind of the literal witch hunts that are ongoing in parts of the world, I think that what I came away feeling was that although we have a tendency, as I say, to kind of dismiss witch hunts as this sort of gothic and slightly embarrassing part of our history, but very much of our history, is that the process of othering and dehumanization by which witch hunts were allowed to happen is something that's still very much going on in different forms. I was very interested in how many of kind of the social interactions that would end up leading to accusations of witchcraft against people would begin with the refusal of charity. An old woman would turn up at her neighbour's door and ask for some butter or some milk, and she would be turned away. And you kind of get this sense that she would then be cast as a witch, almost as this kind of diffusion of guilt from the people who were denying her help. But also that part of the purpose that served was essentially dehumanizing someone, calling them a witch in order to justify their removal from a social group, basically. And that's still something that very much goes on today. I thought of our own tabloid press in the UK and the kind of tone that is leveled at people who receive social help from our government. The demonization of benefit claimants and things like that, I thought was a very obvious parallel to me, or of refugees indeed. So I thought that, well, kind of witch hunts in the form I describe aren't necessarily still endemic in the way they were then. Like I say, those processes of othering and dehumanization, which were kind of the bedrock of them, have been consistent kind of throughout human history up until this day, and perhaps in some ways even more virulent today. Yeah.
Right. From all I've seen and heard, your books have been received very, very well. Critical acclaim, the on shortlist for several prizes, and of course you're doing the literature festival circuit in as best as you can in a world which still has travel restrictions. But I do hope that these times are not going to affect the sales of this book. We are running out of time, almost towards the end of this. I would have liked to have spent more time asking more questions, and perhaps sometime we will get to do that. But I'm going to urge everyone who's watching this session, these are the books, buy them. They're very good books. They're very well worth your time to read and enjoy. Amy, Christina, I wish your books very well. And these are debut novels, so I can just imagine how much we've got to look forward to you from, in the years to come. So thank you very much for joining us on behalf of Tata Literature Live. And it was a personal pleasure to talk to you. I'm now going to hand this back to our MC, Kokila.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Christina. This was an absolutely brilliant session. I'd like to first apologize. I believe that there was an audio issue with our introduction. But thank you so much to our lovely audience for joining us today. The books in this session can actually be purchased online from our knowledge partner, landmarkexsite.com. I personally am going to run and buy both of these books. They sound amazing. A big thank you to our session presenter, the British Council. I hope you check out more sessions at Tata Literature Live 2021, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. Thank you very much.